Today's video, we are continue to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright, who was a renowned American architect who left an indelible mark on the world of architecture and design. Born in 1867, he is widely regarded as one of the most influential architects of the 20th century. An architect who was named Frank Lincoln Wright at birth, shortly after the assassination of Lincoln, and who passed away just before completing the Guggenheim. We find him going with Arthur Miller and his then-wife Marilyn Monroe to search for a location for the young couple's house. So, we can consider Frank Lloyd Wright as a century of America, from Lincoln to Marilyn Monroe. This immense and infinitely prolific architect we will summarize briefly, highlighting his most significant works and the major turning points in his exceptionally long life, as he lived for over 90 years, impacting both his architecture and artistic journey. Let's begin by recalling something important, and that is, like all geniuses, Frank Lloyd Wright did not emerge from thin air. He drew his inspiration from something crucial, which was the creative soil of post-Great Chicago fire. Chicago, as it's well known, burned in 1871, and the effort to rebuild the city gave it a somewhat brutal yet extraordinary impetus. It was in Chicago that skyscrapers were born, what we refer to as the first Chicago School, created by a group of architects who, with the aid of mechanical structures and elevators, pioneered the skyscraper. It's one of the most intriguing paradoxes of Frank Lloyd Wright's career that, despite being the direct disciple of Sullivan, one of the prominent figures in the Chicago School of Architecture, and perhaps the most significant one, a theorist and builder of skyscrapers who altered the course of architectural history, Wright himself chose to make his mark not with skyscrapers, but with individual houses. In fact, within Frank Lloyd Wright, there are two distinct aspects, two different worlds. There's a modern Frank Lloyd Wright. We say he changed architecture because he broke the mold. He began creating architecture with sliding plans and all these formal and aesthetic innovations. He took these ideas to the Netherlands and, through the Netherlands, to Germany, which then altered the course of modern architecture, eventually giving rise to what we now know as the international style. But others see it differently. They say that Frank Lloyd Wright is, above all, a great American artist. He's someone who comes from the romantic naturalism of that American frontier spirit, lovers of independence, lovers of nature, followers of Thoreau, Emerson, and Walt Whitman. It turns out that Frank Lloyd Wright is both things. He was a great modern architect, and at the same time, he was a romantic traditionalist. Philip Johnson slyly referred to him as the best architect of the 19th century. It's true. He developed much of his work in the 19th century, and a significant portion of his architecture is still influenced by the conventions of that century. But he was also the first architect of the 20th century. He emerged within the context of the Chicago School, and we must mention the Holy Trinity of American architects who initiated this movement. In sequential order, first there was Richersen. Richersen was a fascinating character from Louisiana who spoke French. He was educated at the School of Fine Arts in Paris, like many of his peers, because there were no architecture schools in the United States at that time. Upon returning to the United States, he developed a distinctive style, which you can see in the Marshall Field Building in Chicago, a structure that he created with a kind of brutality reminiscent of French Romanesque architecture. Which you can see in the Marshall Field Building in Chicago, a structure that he created with a kind of brutality reminiscent of French Romanesque architecture. And he suddenly disrupted the Beaux-Arts conventions of American architecture with extraordinary force. To give you an idea of how Richersen transformed American architecture, let's fast forward to his successor, the great figure of the Chicago School, Louis Sullivan, who would later become Frank Lloyd Wright's mentor. When the Marshall Field Building was completed in Chicago, it marked a significant shift in American architecture. This was the project that Sullivan had designed for the Auditorium building in Chicago, the largest building he was working on at the time. It was a grand auditorium with offices and hotels, a significant investment and one of great importance. As you can see, it bears a Victorian style with its mansard roofs. This was Sullivan before he was influenced by Richersen. However, after encountering Richersen, this was the building that Sullivan ultimately completed, known as the Auditorium building in Chicago, and it still stands today for anyone interested in visiting it. Richersen, Sullivan, and Frank Lloyd Wright form a sort of holy trinity that initiated contemporary American architecture, contemporary in the sense of modern and influential. With the exception of Thomas Jefferson, the third president who, as you may know, was a refined and cultured architect himself, introducing classicism to the United States through Monticello and the University of Virginia, American architecture truly takes root with these prominent figures. The Auditorium building was created in the context of post-fire Chicago, a city bursting with energy, teeming with inventors and architects who could dream beyond the limitations they faced in Europe, particularly the engineers. When European architects came to America, they would say, "Architects, we can handle that, but it's the engineers creating steel structures, inventing elevators, air conditioning systems like Willis Carrier and Otis. These were the heroes of the Europeans." Yet, there were also architects who were influenced and inspired by this boundless energy and innovation. In the year 1892, there was an attempt to celebrate the quarter-centenary of the discovery of America in Chicago with the Columbian Exposition. However, as often happens with such large-scale events, they didn't quite make it in time, and the Columbian Exposition actually opened in the year 1893. And this was a significant moment. Chicago, seemingly abandoning its roots, had the Columbian Exposition designed by Daniel Burnham, who happened to be a great rival of Sullivan. The exposition was done in a completely Beaux-Arts style, filled with axial symmetry. Nevertheless, it garnered admiration from all quarters. However, it marked the end of the Chicago School, the conclusion of that inventive energy that characterized the Chicago where a young Frank Lloyd Wright lived. To give you an idea of the architectural style that Burnham promoted, it was French classicism. Later on, he developed a plan for Chicago that was quite similar to the one created in the same year, 1909, by Otto Wagner for the Karlsplatz in Vienna. This classical inclination was something that these robust architects of Chicago skyscrapers rejected. However, at the 1893 Columbian Exposition, there were two unique buildings that deviated from the Beaux-Arts norm. One of them was the Golden Door, designed by Sullivan. However, at the 1893 Columbian Exposition, there were two unique buildings that deviated from the Beaux-Arts norm. One of them was the Golden Door designed by Sullivan. The entire complex was designed by his great rival, Burnham, but they gave Sullivan a small commission, this door, and he designed it in contradiction to all the norms of Burnham's French-inspired style. The other building, however, is even more unique. It was a reproduction of a Japanese temple. It can be seen in color, and indeed it should be viewed in color, as it had an extraordinary impact. As you can imagine, on a young Frank Lloyd Wright, this Columbian Exposition, this return to Beaux-Arts patterns, discipline, and styles, was contrary to his interests. However, in this Japanese exhibit he found a source of inspiration that would nourish his entire life. We'll discuss all of this later because, as you may know, he lived in Japan for many years. He was a collector of Japanese prints, wrote books about Japanese prints, and even worked as an art dealer, supplying the Metropolitan Museum of Art with Japanese prints. He became a great expert on Japan, and Japan influenced his work as strongly as his mentor Sullivan, whom he affectionately called Liebermaster, which was the only German word he knew. When he initially studied engineering for a year, he realized it wasn't for him. He then worked with an architect for a couple of years before deciding, I'm going to try to work at the best office in Chicago, Sullivan's office. But to get hired there, you had to show your drawings. This is the drawing he showed Sullivan, the one that got him the job at Sullivan's office. Here it's written, you might be able to read it. Drawings for the master to apply for a job. The drawing I showed Liebermaster, my dear teacher, when I asked him for a job. This drawing won Sullivan's heart and later led him to become the chief draftsman in the studio, like many other architects we'll discuss who didn't have a formal education. Frank Lloyd Wright didn't attend an architecture school. He worked for 8 years and then began learning by doing. Sullivan hired him for 5 years and he said, if you have so much faith in me, lend me $5,000 so I can buy land and build a house. This also shows the audacity of an employee, which is not common to ask the boss for $5,000 right away to buy land and build a house. Sullivan granted him the $5,000 and then he set out to build a house because he had a girlfriend at the time and decided to marry her. Inevitably, he needed a home to raise his children, and this became his first house in Oak Park. It was a neighborhood in Chicago with chalet-style houses, somewhat reminiscent of a garden city, where the emerging new bourgeoisie, a product of the dynamism in post-fire Chicago, was establishing a new identity. But this Wright was not yet the Wright we know. You can see that the house he built for himself in Oak Park had a somewhat referential quality to the single style and the conventions of that time to modernize the vernacular. But the great Wright had not fully emerged at this point. Nonetheless, we preserve it as the place that served as his home and studio for many years. Today, it has this wonderful appearance that you can see thanks to successive restorations. This was his first house, and he was only 22 years old when he built it. However, Wright wasn't quite there yet when he built the house. As I mentioned, he began working for Sullivan. At that time, Sullivan was at the height of his career and was partnered with Adler, an engineer. This partnership was crucial because Sullivan was an artist and a theorist who conceptualized skyscrapers, but he had his office at the back of the studio. Initially, the one dealing with clients and carrying the weight of the business was Adler, who was the engineer, the practical man. So it's true that Wright learned a great deal from Sullivan, his beloved mentor, but he also learned no less from Adler, the other partner in the studio, the engineer. Wright absorbed many of the principles from Adler that he would later apply. So it's true that Wright learned a great deal from Sullivan, his beloved mentor, but he also learned no less from Adler, the other partner in the studio, the engineer. Wright absorbed many of the principles from Adler that he would later apply in his own work. During that time when he was working for Sullivan, this is the Wright family. The young Wright with a mustache in this picture is accompanied by his wife Catherine, one of his sons, and his 2 sisters. Also present is his mother, Anne Lloyd Jones, an extraordinary presence in his life. She had separated from his father when Frank was a teenager, and one of the first things he did was change his middle name. He dropped Lincoln and adopted Lloyd, his mother's maiden name, to clearly demonstrate his connection to her. She lived exclusively for her son, despite having 3 children, Frank being the eldest and 2 other sisters. His mother supported him unconditionally throughout his life, even though she disapproved of all his girlfriends. She was his unwavering pillar of support. Even when he was in his 60s and fell ill with a bad cold while in Japan, his mother, who was in her 80s, traveled to Japan to take care of him. She was one of those remarkable mothers who left an indelible mark on Frank Lloyd Wright's life. His mother and her family, the all-powerful Joe Lloyds as he called them, were Welsh immigrants, and they all followed the Unitarian Christian faith. They were lovers of nature and talented musicians. Frank's father was also an extraordinary musician. Anne, Frank's mother, had separated from her husband, and the family had a deep conviction of being special. Wright's relationship with his maternal family became even closer when he moved to Wisconsin, the state where they had a valley with land where they had tried to recreate the agrarian utopia of their rural Wales, from which they had emigrated to the United States. But in the works he created for Sullivan during that time, there are hints of Wright's influence. This one here is the only one that shows some Wright characteristics. However, it still leans more toward Sullivan with its division into three parts: the base, the middle section, and the crown. Yet, there are elements where we begin to see the young Wright emerging. We know that this particular project was done by Wright because Adler and Sullivan, the partners, handled the larger commissions, while the smaller houses were left to the draftsmen and collaborators they had, including the young and talented Frank, who was the chief draftsman at the time. So, we can attribute this project to him, but he's not yet fully Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright truly becomes himself with the Winslow House, his first independent commission after completing his 5-year contract. He spread his wings while maintaining excellent relations with his mentor Sullivan, establishing his own practice and primarily focusing on residential architecture. During those 15 years, they constructed over 100 buildings, which is truly remarkable. One client would bring in another, and the projects were often houses like this, but not quite like this. Let me explain. You can see the elements of his language that would later become more fully developed, but this is already unmistakably Wright. Is it influenced by Sullivan? Well, yes, in some ways. For example, in the overall organization, there's a sense of solemnity and symmetry, with a lower base, a central body, and a crowning feature, often emphasized by a substantial eave or roof overhang. Of course, in the next chapter, we can continue exploring the creation of Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie houses and his trajectory throughout his career. If you have more questions or if there's anything specific you'd like to know, please feel free to ask. I'm here to assist you. Thank you for your time, and I hope you will enjoy this video. See you next chapter.